"Translate this, and I'll cut your sentence," the judge said with a smirk. Certain the prisoner would fumble, he spoke the words slowly, and the moment the translation left his lips, a hush fell over the room. Judges, jurors, even the bailiff stared. What happened next would change everything. Stay with me until the end, because this twist will leave you stunned. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Courtroom 7B as Marcus Williams shuffled forward in his orange jumpsuit, chains clinking against the polished marble floor. Judge Harrison Caldwell peered down from his elevated bench, his weathered face carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. The morning docket showed another routine sentencing, another young man about to disappear into the system. But sometimes, routine becomes extraordinary in ways no one expects. Marcus had been convicted of armed robbery 3 weeks earlier. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, and now he faced 15 to 20 years behind bars. His court-appointed attorney sat beside him, already packing up files for the next case. The gallery was nearly empty except for a few law students observing proceedings and Marcus's grandmother, her weathered hands clutched around a worn leather purse. Judge Caldwell had seen thousands of cases like this. Young men from broken homes, limited opportunities, making desperate choices that destroyed their futures. He'd grown cynical over the decades, believing that harsh sentences were the only language these defendants understood. But today, something nagged at him. Maybe it was the defendant's quiet dignity throughout the trial, or the way his grandmother had attended every hearing despite her obvious frailty. The judge shuffled through his papers, reviewing the pre-sentence report one final time. Marcus Williams, age 24, high school dropout, no prior violent offenses. Raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. The robbery had netted barely $300 from a corner store. Desperation, not malice, had driven him to that moment of poor judgment. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, standing with practiced authority, "the state recommends the maximum sentence of 20 years. Mr. Williams entered that store with a loaded weapon, terrorizing an innocent shopkeeper. We must send a clear message that such behavior will not be tolerated in our community." Judge Caldwell nodded mechanically, having heard similar arguments countless times. The defense attorney offered a half-hearted plea for leniency, citing Marcus's difficult childhood and lack of prior convictions. But even she seemed resigned to the inevitable outcome. The system had its rhythms, its predictable patterns. As the judge prepared to deliver his sentence, his eyes fell upon a document tucked between the case files, a letter written in elegant script, the handwriting flowing like art across the page. It was addressed to the court, written in what appeared to be Latin. The judge frowned, wondering how this had ended up in his files. His curiosity piqued despite himself. Judge Caldwell had studied Latin in law school, though he'd rarely encountered it outside of legal maxims. This letter was different, more complex, filled with nuances he couldn't quite grasp. The words seemed familiar yet foreign, like a melody half-remembered from childhood. He found himself staring at the document, his prepared sentence momentarily forgotten. The courtroom waited in respectful silence, accustomed to the judge's deliberative pauses. But this hesitation felt different. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, and even the prosecutor glanced at his watch with growing impatience. Marcus stood quietly beside his attorney, his shoulders squared despite the chains binding his wrists. He'd accepted his fate weeks ago, understanding that his moment of desperation would cost him the best years of his life. His grandmother had visited him every day in county lockup, bringing homemade cookies and stories about the neighborhood. She'd taught him strength through adversity, dignity in defeat. But as Judge Caldwell continued staring at the mysterious document, something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The air grew thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. The judge's reputation for swift, harsh sentences was legendary among local attorneys. His courtroom ran like clockwork, with no tolerance for delays or dramatics. The letter contained passages that seemed to dance between languages, mixing Latin with phrases the judge couldn't identify. Certain words jumped out at him, legal terms that suggested deep knowledge of jurisprudence and philosophy. Whoever had written this understood not just language, but the very foundations of justice itself. Judge Caldwell's mind raced as he tried to decipher the elegant script. The letter spoke of mercy and justice, of second chances and the weight of judicial responsibility. But more intriguingly, it contained references to obscure legal precedents, philosophical arguments that challenged the very nature of punishment versus rehabilitation. This wasn't the work of some amateur legal scholar or prison house lawyer. The prosecutor cleared his throat impatiently, but Judge Caldwell raised his hand for silence. His decades of experience told him this moment was significant, though he couldn't yet understand why. The document seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, each carefully crafted sentence building toward some greater revelation. Marcus noticed the judge's intense focus on the papers before him. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of hope, not for a reduced sentence but for something more elusive. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that he was more than just another statistic in the criminal justice system. The courtroom's silence stretched on, growing more charged with each passing moment. Law students leaned forward in their seats, sensing they were witnessing something that would become courthouse legend. The bailiff's hand instinctively moved closer to his weapon, though he couldn't explain why tension was building in what should have been a routine proceeding. Judge Caldwell finally looked up from the mysterious letter, his eyes finding Marcus with new intensity. The young man met his gaze steadily, no longer the defeated defendant who had entered the courtroom. Something had changed, shifted in ways that defied explanation. The very air seemed to vibrate with possibility. What the judge didn't know was that Marcus had spent his childhood immersed in languages, taught by his grandmother who had immigrated from a small European village where multiple dialects blended together. His apparent lack of education masked a brilliant mind that absorbed languages like a sponge absorbs water. The streets had claimed his body, but they had never touched his intellect. The document in Judge Caldwell's hands was about to transform everything everyone thought they knew about the young man standing in chains before them. Justice was about to take an unexpected turn, and the ripple effects would change lives in ways no one could predict. The translation that was coming would shatter assumptions and reveal truths that had been hidden in plain sight. But first, the judge had to make his unusual offer, one that would echo through the courthouse for years to come. Judge Caldwell set the mysterious letter aside, his mind still reeling from its elegant complexity. The courtroom remained suspended in that strange tension, everyone waiting for him to proceed with what should have been a straightforward sentencing. But nothing about this morning felt straightforward anymore. The judge's eyes swept across the courtroom, taking in the expectant faces. His reputation for swift justice had been built over 3 decades of consistent, predictable rulings. Defendants knew what to expect when they stood before Harrison Caldwell's bench. Harsh sentences delivered with surgical precision, no room for sob stories or last-minute appeals to emotion. But today, something gnawed at him. Maybe it was the letter's haunting prose about justice and mercy. Maybe it was the quiet dignity Marcus had maintained throughout his trial. Or maybe it was the way the young man's grandmother sat in the gallery, her faith unshaken despite watching her grandson's life crumble before her eyes. The prosecutor shifted impatiently, checking his watch again. He had 3 more cases on the docket before lunch, and Judge Caldwell's unusual hesitation was throwing off the entire schedule. The defense attorney looked equally puzzled, her closing arguments long finished, resignation already settling into her features. Marcus stood perfectly still, his breathing steady despite the weight of chains around his wrists. Prison had taught him patience, but more than that, His grandmother had taught him grace under pressure. She'd survived wars, famines, and the long journey to America with nothing but her wits and determination. That same steel ran through his veins, even if the world couldn't see it beneath his circumstances. Judge Caldwell picked up the letter again, his fingers tracing the elegant script. The words seemed to shimmer under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lighting, revealing layers of meaning he'd missed in his first reading. This wasn't just legal philosophy written in classical language. This was poetry disguised as jurisprudence, art masquerading as argument. The more he studied the document, the more convinced he became that its author possessed not just linguistic brilliance, but deep understanding of legal precedent spanning centuries. References to obscure Roman law intertwined with citations from modern constitutional scholarship. Whoever had penned this letter understood justice from every angle, every historical perspective. A wild thought began forming in the judge's mind, an impossible thought that challenged everything he believed about the young man standing before his bench. The letter had appeared mysteriously in Marcus's case file, written in languages that required years of dedicated study to master. Could it be possible that this convicted robber, this high school dropout from the projects, had authored such sophisticated legal discourse? The idea should have been laughable. Marcus Williams's public defender had painted a picture of limited education, missed opportunities, and desperate circumstances. The prosecution had portrayed him as another product of urban decay, destined for violence and crime. Neither narrative left room for scholarly brilliance hidden beneath the surface. But Judge Caldwell had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and his instincts were screaming that nothing about this case was what it seemed. The defendant's composure throughout the trial hadn't been resignation. It had been the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what was happening around him, even as others underestimated his capabilities. The courtroom's atmosphere grew more charged as the judge's silence stretched on. The bailiff noticed several reporters had slipped into the back rows, their cameras and notebooks ready to capture whatever unusual drama was unfolding. Word traveled fast in the courthouse when Judge Caldwell deviated from his predictable patterns. Marcus's grandmother pressed her weathered hands together in silent prayer. She'd raised that boy from age 12, watching his brilliant mind absorb everything she taught him about their family's history, their languages, their traditions. The streets had claimed his body temporarily, but they had never touched his soul or his intellect. She'd always known this day would come when the world would see what she'd always seen in her grandson. The prosecutor finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "Your Honor, if we could proceed with sentencing, I have several other matters on the calendar this morning." Judge Caldwell looked up sharply, his eyes flashing with an authority that reminded everyone why he commanded such respect in legal circles. "This court will proceed when I determine it's appropriate to proceed," he said coldly. "Not according to your schedule." The rebuke sent ripples through the courtroom. Judge Caldwell rarely needed to assert his authority so directly. His reputation usually preceded him, keeping attorneys in line without dramatic displays. But something about this moment demanded that he take complete control, that he follow his instincts regardless of courtroom protocol. Marcus watched the exchange with growing interest. For weeks, he'd observed the legal machinery grinding toward his inevitable imprisonment. But now, for the first time since his arrest, something had shifted. The judge's demeanor had changed completely, transforming from perfunctory authority to genuine engagement. The mysterious letter lay between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Judge Caldwell understood its significance even if he couldn't yet prove its authorship. The document represented everything the justice system claimed to value but rarely achieved: intellectual rigor, moral complexity, deep understanding of humanity's struggle between vengeance and mercy. "Mr. Williams," Judge Caldwell said suddenly, his voice carrying new weight, "I have here a document that appeared in your case file, a letter written in classical Latin, discussing the philosophical foundations of criminal justice." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Several reporters leaned forward, sensing a story developing beyond their wildest expectations. The prosecutor's confident expression wavered as he realized the morning's routine had completely derailed. Marcus met the judge's gaze directly, his expression revealing nothing, but something flickered in his eyes, a spark of recognition that confirmed Judge Caldwell's growing suspicions. The young man understood exactly what was being discussed, even if he chose to remain silent. The author of this letter demonstrates remarkable scholarship, the judge continued, his voice gaining momentum. Knowledge of legal precedent, spanning from Roman law to modern constitutional interpretation, familiarity with multiple classical languages, deep philosophical understanding of justice itself. The defense attorney looked completely bewildered, glancing between her client and the judge with growing confusion. She'd never seen any evidence of such intellectual capacity in Marcus Williams. Their conversations had been brief, practical discussions about plea bargains and sentencing guidelines. But Marcus's grandmother smiled softly from the gallery, her eyes shining with pride and anticipation. She'd waited years for someone to recognize what she'd always known about her grandson. The moment was arriving when his hidden brilliance would finally be acknowledged by the world that had dismissed him. Judge Caldwell held up the letter, its elegant script visible to everyone in the courtroom. "The question before this court is simple," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of impending revelation. "Who authored this remarkable piece of legal scholarship?" The silence that followed was absolute, charged with possibility and disbelief. Everyone understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment that would reshape everything they thought they knew about justice, education, and human potential. Marcus stood perfectly still, his chains catching the light as his breathing remained steady. The next few minutes would either vindicate a lifetime of hidden brilliance or confirm society's lowest expectations. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt ready for whatever came next. The judge was about to make his unusual offer, and the courtroom held its collective breath. Judge Caldwell set the letter down deliberately, his weathered fingers drumming against the mahogany bench. The courtroom's tension had reached a breaking point, every person present sensing they stood at the precipice of something extraordinary. The morning sun slanted through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor where Marcus Williams waited in his orange jumpsuit. "Mr. Williams," the judge began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This letter contains passages that would challenge most law professors. Complex arguments about judicial philosophy written in flawless Latin, interwoven with references to legal precedents spanning centuries." Marcus remained motionless, but his grandmother's soft intake of breath was audible from the gallery. She'd taught him those languages herself, sitting at their kitchen table night after night, sharing stories of their ancestors who had crossed borders carrying nothing but words and wisdom. The streets had tried to erase that heritage, but it lived on in the boy she'd raised. The prosecutor's confidence began wavering as he watched the judge's unprecedented behavior. Harrison Caldwell didn't engage in theatrical displays. He sentenced defendants efficiently and moved on to the next case. This prolonged examination of some mysterious document was completely outside his established pattern. "The author of this letter," Judge Caldwell continued, holding up the elegant script for all to see, "demonstrates not only linguistic mastery, but profound understanding of justice itself. They write about mercy and accountability with the wisdom of someone who has studied human nature from every angle." The defense attorney leaned forward, her confusion evident. She'd spent hours with Marcus Williams preparing for trial, discussing strategy in simple terms she assumed matched his educational level. Never once had he displayed the intellectual capacity the judge was describing. Her client had seemed resigned to his fate, speaking only when necessary, answering questions with brief responses that revealed nothing of hidden depths. But Marcus's stillness wasn't resignation anymore. It was the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what was unfolding around him. His chains caught the light as he breathed steadily, waiting for the moment that would either vindicate years of hidden brilliance or confirm society's expectations about young men like him. The reporters in the back rows sensed blood in the water. Cameras focused on the young defendant, trying to capture whatever drama was building in Courtroom 7B. This wasn't just another routine sentencing. Something unprecedented was happening, and they didn't want to miss a single moment. Judge Caldwell's eyes never left Marcus as he spoke. The philosophical arguments in this letter reference Cicero's thoughts on natural law, Augustine's concepts of divine justice, and modern constitutional scholars' interpretations of due process. The author quotes Blackstone's commentaries in the original Latin, then seamlessly transitions to contemporary Supreme Court decisions. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as people tried to process what they were hearing. Law students frantically took notes, recognizing they were witnessing something that would become courthouse legend. The bailiff's hand remained near his weapon, though the tension was intellectual rather than physical. Marcus's grandmother closed her eyes briefly, remembering the boy who had devoured every book she brought home from the library. He'd learned Latin by age 14, not from formal classes, but from her patient instruction and his own relentless curiosity. The world had seen only his circumstances, never his capabilities. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice gaining intensity, this letter discusses the intersection of criminal justice and social responsibility, with nuance that suggests deep personal experience with both sides of the law. The author writes not as an academic observer, but as someone who understands the human cost of judicial decisions. The prosecutor stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking. Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance of this document to today's sentencing. Mr. Williams was convicted of armed robbery. The evidence was overwhelming. His educational background is irrelevant to the crimes he committed. Judge Caldwell's gaze shifted to the prosecutor with withering intensity. Everything is relevant when determining an appropriate sentence, he replied coldly. The law requires us to consider all factors that might inform our understanding of the defendant and the appropriate path forward. Marcus felt the weight of 3 decades worth of assumptions about his capabilities. Every teacher who had written him off, every social worker who had seen only his zip code, every person who had looked at his circumstances and decided his potential was limited. But his grandmother had taught him that intelligence wasn't defined by formal education or economic status. Brilliance could flourish anywhere, even in the most unlikely soil. The mysterious letter had somehow found its way into his case file, appearing at the exact moment when it might make a difference. Marcus didn't believe in coincidences, but he did believe in preparation meeting opportunity. His grandmother had prepared him for this moment his entire life, even if neither of them had known when it would arrive. Judge Caldwell picked up the letter again, studying specific passages that seemed to glow under the courtroom's harsh lighting. The author writes, "Justice divorced from mercy becomes mere vengeance, while mercy without accountability becomes mere sentiment. True judicial wisdom lies in finding the precise balance that serves both individual redemption and societal protection." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the criminal justice system typically produced. These weren't the thoughts of someone seeking to excuse criminal behavior, but rather the insights of someone who understood the complex relationship between personal responsibility and social circumstances. Marcus's breathing remained steady, but something had shifted in his posture. The quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout his trial was transforming into something more active, more engaged. For weeks, he'd watched the legal machinery process his case with mechanical efficiency. But now, for the first time, someone was looking beyond the surface. The defense attorney finally found her voice. "Your Honor, while this document is certainly interesting, I'm not sure how it relates to my client's case. Mr. Williams has never demonstrated the kind of scholarly ability you're describing." Judge Caldwell's smile was sharp as a razor. "Has anyone ever asked him to demonstrate it?" The question silenced the courtroom completely. Has anyone in this system ever looked beyond his circumstances to discover what capabilities might lie beneath the surface. The challenge was unmistakable. The judge was calling out everyone present for their assumptions, their willingness to accept surface appearances without deeper investigation. Marcus Williams had been processed through the system like thousands of others, his potential never explored because no one had bothered to look. Marcus's grandmother opened her eyes, meeting the judge's gaze with quiet strength. She'd raised that boy to be ready for this moment, even though she hadn't known when it would come. The world was about to discover what she'd always known about her grandson's extraordinary mind. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Judge Caldwell prepared to make his unprecedented offer. The morning's routine had completely dissolved, replaced by something that would challenge everyone's understanding of justice, education, and human potential. "Mr. Williams," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench, "I'm going to make you an unusual proposition." The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Caldwell lifted the mysterious letter one final time. The elegant script seemed to pulse with hidden meaning, representing everything the justice system claimed to value but rarely achieved. This moment would either vindicate a lifetime of hidden brilliance or confirm society's lowest expectations. Marcus stood perfectly still, his chains catching the morning light as he prepared to either rise to an unprecedented challenge or watch his last chance at redemption slip away. The next few words would change everything for everyone in that courtroom. The judge's eyes locked onto Marcus with laser intensity as he prepared to speak the words that would echo through courthouse history for decades to come. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped together as he studied Marcus with newfound intensity. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to spotlight the young man in orange, transforming him from anonymous defendant to central figure in an unfolding drama that no one could have predicted. "Mr. Williams," the judge began, his voice carrying 3 decades of judicial authority. "This letter that mysteriously appeared in your file demonstrates scholarship that would impress professors at Harvard Law School. The question that haunts me is simple: who wrote it?" The courtroom remained frozen in anticipation. Marcus's breathing stayed steady, but his grandmother noticed the slight straightening of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible shift from resignation to readiness. She'd seen that look before, when he was 12 years old and had translated an entire page of Virgil's Aeneid during their evening lessons at the kitchen table. "The linguistic complexity alone," Judge Caldwell continued, "suggests years of dedicated study, classical Latin interwoven with modern legal terminology, philosophical arguments that span centuries of jurisprudence. This isn't the work of someone with casual familiarity with ancient languages." The prosecutor's face had gone pale. His case had seemed ironclad just moments ago, built on assumptions about education, opportunity, and social circumstances that suddenly felt shaky beneath his feet. The defense attorney looked equally bewildered, glancing between her client and the mysterious document that was reshaping everything she thought she knew. Marcus met the judge's gaze directly for the first time since entering the courtroom. Something electric passed between them, an acknowledgement that transcended the formal boundaries of their respective roles. The young man's silence wasn't defiance or ignorance. It was patience, the kind that came from years of being underestimated while possessing capabilities no one bothered to discover. "The author of this letter," Judge Caldwell said, holding up the elegant script, "writes about justice with the insight of someone who has experienced both sides of the law. They understand not just legal theory, but the human cost of judicial decisions. The philosophical depth suggests someone who has had considerable time to contemplate the nature of mercy, accountability, and redemption." The reporters in the back rows leaned forward, their cameras capturing every moment of this unprecedented courtroom drama. This wasn't just another sentencing. This was something that would challenge fundamental assumptions about intelligence, education, and human potential hidden in plain sight. Marcus's grandmother pressed her hands together, remembering the countless nights she'd watched her grandson absorb languages like a sponge absorbs water. He'd learned Latin by candlelight after the electricity was shut off, studying by streetlight when they couldn't afford proper lamps. The streets had claimed his body temporarily, but they had never touched his brilliant mind. "So, here's my proposition," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice cutting through the charged silence. "If you can translate this letter accurately, demonstrating not just linguistic ability, but genuine understanding of its philosophical arguments, I will reduce your sentence to time served plus community service." The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. The bailiff's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, though the tension was intellectual rather than physical. Several law students frantically scribbled notes, recognizing they were witnessing something that would become courthouse legend. "However," the judge continued, raising his voice above the murmur, "if you cannot translate it, or if your translation reveals superficial understanding rather than genuine scholarship, you will receive the maximum sentence of 25 years without possibility of parole." The stakes couldn't have been higher. Marcus faced either vindication of a lifetime's hidden brilliance or the harshest possible consequences for his moment of desperation. The prosecutor looked stunned, his carefully constructed case suddenly transformed into something entirely different. Marcus's chains clinked softly as he shifted slightly, the only sound in a courtroom that had fallen completely silent. His grandmother's eyes shone with tears of pride and terror, understanding that her grandson's entire future hung in the balance of the next few minutes. "Furthermore," Judge Caldwell added, his gaze never leaving Marcus, "you must translate it orally, here and now, without notes or reference materials. True scholarship requires not just memorization, but deep comprehension that allows for spontaneous demonstration of knowledge." The defense attorney finally found her voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. My client has the right to consult with counsel before making such a decision. Your client has the right to decline my offer," the judge replied sharply. "But if he accepts, he does so understanding the full consequences of success or failure." Marcus looked toward his grandmother, seeing in her weathered face the same quiet strength that had sustained him through childhood trauma, poverty, and the desperate circumstances that had led to his arrest. She nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that contained decades of love, faith, and unwavering belief in his capabilities. The young man turned back to face Judge Caldwell, his voice clear and steady when he finally spoke. "I accept your challenge, Your Honor." The words echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The prosecutor jumped to his feet, objecting strenuously to what he called judicial grandstanding and circus theatrics. But Judge Caldwell silenced him with a look that could have frozen molten steel. "Mr. Williams," the judge said, lifting the mysterious letter with both hands, "the court is prepared to hear your translation." Marcus straightened his shoulders, the chains around his wrists suddenly feeling lighter. For the first time in months, he felt the familiar rush of intellectual challenge, the same excitement he'd experienced as a child when his grandmother presented him with increasingly complex texts to decipher. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim as all attention focused on the young man in orange. Cameras captured every angle as he prepared to either vindicate years of hidden scholarship or confirm society's expectations about his limitations. Judge Caldwell began reading the Latin text slowly, each word pronounced with careful precision. The elegant script seemed to come alive as ancient words filled the modern courtroom, bridging centuries of human struggle with questions of justice, mercy, and redemption. Marcus listened intently, his brilliant mind parsing not just the individual words, but the complex philosophical arguments woven throughout the text. This wasn't simple translation. This required deep understanding of legal history, moral philosophy, and the intersection of personal responsibility with social circumstances. The courtroom held its breath as Marcus began his response, his voice gaining confidence with each carefully chosen word. What emerged wasn't just translation, but interpretation that revealed layers of meaning hidden within the elegant Latin prose. As he spoke, something remarkable happened. The young man everyone had dismissed as another statistic began demonstrating intellectual capacity that left seasoned attorneys speechless. His translation revealed not just linguistic mastery, but profound understanding of jurisprudence that spanned centuries. The prosecutor's objections died in his throat as he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented. The defense attorney stared at her client as if seeing him for the first time, and Judge Caldwell smiled slowly, recognizing that his instincts had been correct about the extraordinary mind hidden beneath society's assumptions. But Marcus wasn't finished. As he continued his translation, he began adding commentary that revealed even deeper understanding of the text's implications for modern criminal justice. His analysis was brilliant, nuanced, and completely unexpected from someone the system had written off as another lost cause. The transformation was complete. Marcus Williams was no longer just another defendant awaiting sentencing. He had become living proof that human potential could flourish anywhere, even in the most unlikely circumstances, if someone bothered to look beyond surface appearances. The courtroom sat mesmerized as this remarkable young man continued demonstrating capabilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about intelligence, education, and the relationship between circumstances and potential. Judge Caldwell leaned back in his chair, watching justice take an entirely unexpected turn as Marcus's brilliant translation echoed through the stunned courtroom, forever changing everyone's understanding of what was possible when society finally bothered to truly see the people it had dismissed. Marcus's flawless translation echoed through the stunned courtroom, each word dismantling decades of assumptions about intelligence, potential, and the human capacity for greatness hidden in plain sight. Judge Caldwell kept his promise, reducing the sentence to time served plus community service, but more importantly, he had witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his judicial career. The young man who had entered that courtroom as another statistic walked out as living proof that brilliance doesn't always arrive in expected packages. Marcus went on to complete his law degree, eventually becoming a public defender who specialized in cases involving defendants whose potential had been overlooked by the system. His grandmother lived to see him argue his first case before the same judge who had given him that life-changing opportunity. The mysterious letter? It had been written by Marcus himself during his time in county lockup, slipped into his own case file by a sympathetic clerk who recognized his extraordinary mind. Sometimes the system works not because of its design, but in spite of it, when someone dares to look beyond the surface and see the human being underneath. This story reminds us that genius can emerge from anywhere, that circumstances don't define capability, and that one moment of recognition can transform not just a life, but our entire understanding of justice itself.